for teachers and staff, along with other documents, including frequently asked questions and extended school year guidance. These are all available on RIDE's website, and I think Mark is going to share it in our chat. You'll have a link to that. What this won't cover today, we won't be talking about procedural safeguards in detail. We won't be talking about timelines in detail, even though we might touch on them. Those are all covered in our basic rights webinar, which can also be found on our online offerings on our website. And if you are offered, or if you're interested at all in the IEP form for students aged 3 to 13, or if you know anyone who is, that one is typically offered in the office, and hopefully we'll be able to get that up online soon. Okay, so let's get into our webinar. Okay, so here we go. This is a familiar site probably. Even if you haven't built a house yourself, you most likely have seen a blueprint before. We know that a blueprint gives us the basic components and critical components in constructing something, correct? And the IEP form has the very same similarities. We need to follow certain steps. You can't build the roof of a house before you build the foundation. So what we do with this workshop is kind of liken it to building a house. You'll also sometimes hear me refer to how I'm not really a sewer. However, I'm going to use that kind of analogy that it's like a thread that weaves through from beginning to end. That never made much sense to me until I sat down and started to learn about the IEP form itself, and hopefully that might help link things for you too. So students with disabilities must be provided a free and appropriate public education designed to meet his or her unique needs. Unique, that's the individualized in the IEP. So this education must be provided in the least restrictive environment. And this, the foundation of this program that we're going to build is the IEP. So we're going to give you, we get those components from IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and our Rhode Island regulations. Okay, next slide. So here's what we hope you will leave with today, these three things. We hope that you'll understand the role of the secondary transition IEP as it relates to life after high school. We hope that you will recognize the importance of transition assessments. We're going to talk a little bit about those later, in creating long-term goals. And we hope you'll become more engaged in developing and sharing responsibility for transition services that meet student needs. Okay. We talked about that blueprint. Here are all the components. I'm not going to read off each one. I'm going to ask that we list all 9. These are all the major components required by IDEA in an IEP. We're going to talk about each one of these components in depth from here on in and what that means for your student. Hopefully it all comes together. And within these next few slides, we're going to revisit the transition process. Okay, next slide, please. So hopefully this is a word that you may have been using throughout your own lives, in your child's lives. We're always transitioning from one thing to another. If your child was in preschool, he transitioned to kindergarten. If he was when he was left kindergarten, he might have gone to a different school and he transitioned to a new environment there. We transition throughout our lives. So as it pertains to what we're talking about today, it's really the skills that we're talking about are things that you most likely, one way or another, have been working on with your child since they were small. However, this particular focus today is around transition is defined as something for students age 14 and older in Rhode Island, which is a little bit different than other states. Other states sometimes start at 16. We find that 14 and even younger, because there's nothing that stops you from addressing transition earlier. We find that transitions in general need some planning, right? So they're the basic life and employment skills that people need to make that transition successful. In school, transition schools, you might, like I said, you might even need practice transitioning from one class to another. Hallways can often be difficult for some students. In life, we might need to adapt to a new environment, make decisions, cope with stress. And in the workplace, getting along with coworkers, maybe adapting to new responsibilities. So you can see that, again, if we wait until we're in a workplace and we don't have those skills, we needed to have practiced them. So I'll give you an example. If my son or my student is, somebody bumps into him in the hallway, he might come home and he might talk about it for days, maybe weeks, right? If we don't work on those skills and talk about it when he's in a work environment and has some sort of encounter with another employee or maybe with the public, that employer is not going to always know how to handle that best. So the more practice we get at these things, the more successful our youth will be. Okay. Here's some of those life and employment skills. Again, some of these might come naturally to your student or your youth. Some of them might need a little more work than others. There's a lot of skills in life. We all need to work on some of them. If you think about these, I'm just going to pick out a couple of them. If we talk about communication, are we adept or at least practicing listening to others, how we speak to others, common sense, judgment and decision making? As far as technology, although I have to say some youth have quite a handle on technology, but they still need to be able to access resources. Accessing the internet, using things on your phone is pretty convenient. And then checking accounts, credit cards, paying bills, things like that. Skills that every single adult needs to know. Okay. And then let's see. So we're starting on this page of the IEP because it's rather important. And again, because this workshop is particular to students ages 14 to 22, this is a big point of a youth's life where they're approaching their 18th birthday, and the IEP process builds this in to make sure that families, individuals all know that this is coming. So this transfer of rights means that when a student turns 18, they are now responsible for making their own decisions. They may still listen to you, they may not, we don't know, right? However, the IEP process makes sure that we stop and answer these questions. If you're 17 or will turn 17 within the time frame of the IEP that you're looking at that point, we need to check yes. At that time, they also need to be shown that they have been given a copy of the procedural safeguards. I mentioned those briefly before. That's that document that basically sums up all of a family's rights, responsibilities as far as the IEP process. So at that point, the student also needs to be given a copy of that if they are going to be reaching 18. Okay, and then I'm just going to briefly touch on this. If this is the first IEP for a student, very first time that a student will be receiving or an IEP will be going into effect for this student, then this is the only time that we write in the date on when that first original parent consent was signed for that IEP. Okay, next. Okay, so information for parents. The IEPs here make sure that families know that those procedural safeguards that we talked about are given to a parent at least these times. Once a year. Now, I'm sure everybody remembers being handed the booklet. Sometimes you have the right to say, no, I've got enough. Thank you, I'm all set. But they do need to provide it to you. Upon initial referral, or if a parent requests evaluations, then it needs to be provided to the parent. If a parent files for a state complaint or a due process complaint in which there's a disagreement, then that needs to be provided to the family. And then anytime a parent requests that. So, the next piece is district information must be provided on the local advisory committee. So many of our districts in the state have very active local advisory committees. Some may be going through some transitions, but if there's information on meetings and there needs to be at least 4 meetings a year. So that information needs to be shared with families at each IEP meeting. This is something that is in our basic rights webinar, but I do want to make sure that you know the parent's signature is not required in an IEP. That's been a myth for many years. For the most part, we do a lot of work to try to make sure families understand that if you are in disagreement on any piece of an IEP, whether it starts with the data, whether it starts with a goal, whether it starts with placement, then if you do nothing and you've been given a prior written notice, which is what details your rights and tells you what change is going to be made to an IEP and when it's going to happen, which is 10 days after that form is given to you. Then if you disagree with it, you need to take an action. You need to either call another IEP meeting, you need to have, if you've tried everything, if you had enough IEP meetings and you just can't come to an agreement with your team, then you need to call Rhode Island Department of Education and request some sort of dispute resolution, which usually begins with mediation. Okay, so that's a little different. When we talk about prior written notice, a lot of times we have parents who, it's easy to confuse that with a meeting notice. A meeting notice is something that you get once you've decided on the time and a date and the time for your meetings, and you should be receiving a notice that tells you what that time and date is and who is expected to be at the meeting. That's a little bit different. That is called an IEP meeting notice versus a prior written notice. Okay, I'm gonna stop here. I think it's a good time. Kind of a little bit of some dry information. I don't know if you have any questions, and if you do, we are open to those now.
And can I also ask you to touch on just one little thing?
Mm-hmm.
So on the form, parental consent for the initial provision of special education, because we talk about there's no signatures on an IEP, but there's that one time.
Correct.
That parents have to sign. Could you touch on that and what that box means up on the above that?
Absolutely. So I talked just the most recent thing I said around a signature not being required. It's good to clarify this, as Deb said, because that parental consent for initial provision is the only time that signature is required. So parents can get right up until the doorway of special education. They could have gone through the referral process, the evaluation process. The team could determine that the child is eligible for an IEP. And yet at that point, there's still this safeguard for parents to stop and make a conscious decision to consent to special education services moving forward. Not just an IEP, or actually not an IEP in this case, well, not what's in it. It's to actually entering that world of special education. Okay. All right, any questions?
So no questions at this point. And folks in the audience, if you have any questions at any point, feel free to click the Q&A button and type those in. And we'll be pausing again periodically throughout the presentation to try to answer those. But for now, I think it's actually, we're going to turn it over to Beth.
Hi all. So we are going to head to the very first page of your IEP, and we're looking right at the very top, that banner that is going across the top that is dealing with dates. That's going to be on every page of this IEP document. The meeting date is the last meeting, the IEP meeting that you held with your team. And then the IEP effective dates will have a from and to date. It can be no longer than a 12-month period. And this is when your IEP is in effect and ultimately when it expires. And so this is an important date for you to hold on to. If you are noticing that you are approaching that expiration date and you haven't heard from your team and you haven't been in contact with them, you might want to reach out and get that process rolling, because again, that IEP is only good for 12 months. And over on the right-hand side, every page is going to have the page number and how many pages the document is. Some kiddos only have a 12-page IEP. Some kiddos have a 30-page IEP. So these are important numbers because if you have a lengthy document, you want to be able to keep control of those pages. And again, this is an IEP for students ages 14 to 22. As we move down the document, I am out of order in my notes. This is very basic information. You've got your student's last name, first name, date of birth. And then over on the right-hand side, there is an SASID, and that stands for State Assigned Student Identification Number. That's something that your district will provide to you. And then your second row has your home school, current grade, and current school. And there's a reason why those are two different boxes for your schools. The home school is what school your student would attend based on your location in the district. And the current school is the school that he or she is actually attending based on the program or classroom that he or she needs. They may be different schools, they may be the same school. For your contact person, that's going to be your case manager, and you're going to have that person's contact phone number and email. Is your student an English language learner? Yes or no? And your student's home or native language, which is very important to know. And we're going to get into the parents' native language and why that's important in this process. So very basic, again, information about parents and guardians. I'm just going to skip right down to home native language. What language does that parent speak at home, and is an interpreter needed? Parents have a right to an interpreter to be at meetings to assist them in that process, and the district is required to provide that for the families. If you skip down past the second parent or guardian's information, there's a line for an education surrogate. And that would be if a student had a surrogate assigned by the state, possibly through like an organization like DCYF. The purpose of the meeting, you've got three choices there. The initial IEP, which is if we're just getting started in the process. An annual review, which is a student who has had an IEP, and this is those yearly renewals of that document, or if this is part of the reevaluation process, which needs to take place at least every 3 years. And if you look at the next line, it goes on to ask, when were the most recent evaluations done and when are they due next? And that's really important when we're talking about student progress. And if a student is struggling or not making the progress that we like, sometimes we like to go back and see, well, when was the last time we did evaluations? Are they due? Do we need to do them sooner than 3 years to get more current data? The anticipated graduation date or student reaching the age of 22. So this is going to be, again, either the day that we're expecting the student to graduate or his or her 22nd birthday date. Graduation is a change of placement, and so families need to know when that's happening. No surprises are allowed in this process. And so this date can change. You know, we may, as a team, decide, okay, this student is going to need 1 extra year to complete his whole goals. And then during the process, you may realize they're going to need a little bit more time to do that. And that's something that the team will get together and discuss, and that date can change. The next line talks about summary of performance. This is basically a document, a summary of everything that the student has completed in terms of transition and work experience and things along those lines. It's a great document that informs any future services. It is helpful info for the next steps. Anne, you have anything to add to that?
I wanted to add something around recent evaluations in the 3-year period. When we use that 3-year kind of example, not example, but it's important as far as if there's a time before that 3-year, maybe around the 2nd year, that things are kind of falling apart, things aren't going well, and the family has concerns that maybe there's been some great changes and that the data that we've used to develop the current IEP is not necessarily reflecting where that student is at anymore, then it's possible for a team to decide at 2 years that that it's time to do them a little bit early. It might be time to do one of them a little bit early. There's definitely some leeway as far as a team coming together and either doing them a little early or deciding that we can wait a little longer, even if it goes past that 3-year date. It's always part of a really good, rich conversation to be had to determine if everyone's in agreement, then we can do that. We can have a little bit of flexibility in those years. And again, it doesn't always fall on a calendar date, or it's not exactly a time frame that's set in stone. Anything else on that, Deb?
And can I just add to one of the things that the IEP form doesn't, and again, we're really just walking through the form. We do have lots of answers that come up in our other workshops, like basic rights and special education. This page in particular, so the most recent evaluation, you notice it only shows a date. But the thing is, it could be that that date is reflecting a speech and language evaluation. But now we're seeing that this child needs an OT evaluation. So what you might see here is, let's say the student had a speech and language evaluation in August of 2019. So schools are probably going 3 years from there. So 19, 20, 20. The next evaluation date may say August of 2022. However, it's important for families to keep that the most recent copies of that evaluation data, and also ask that at those meetings, because just because it says next evaluation date, that's only pertains to the type of evaluation that was done last, and it should not prohibit from doing getting additional evaluation data that hasn't been done. Exactly. That was kind of a mouthful, but I think it's really important to remember that at this point. It's something that I wish would have been on that form, but it's not. So parents really need to have be cognizant of that.
Right, and there's nothing that stops a parent from writing it in yourself. Nothing is required by the regulations, but it's a great tip. Write those things on as soon as you get your newest form. It's something to keep them a nice running total of and some dates. Okay.
Thanks, ladies.
Hey.
So the second part of this particular page talks about the team meeting participants. And we've got the names on one side with their signature, their role at the meeting, and just showing that they were in attendance. And I'm just going to kind of run through these very quickly because these are the people that are required for an IEP meeting to actually be a true IEP meeting. Starting at age 16, the student needs to be invited. And that means the student needs his or her own invitation. This is not an addendum to mom and dad's invite. The student needs his or her own invite. And we're going to get into a little bit about whether or not the student is attending and what that looks like. The parent or guardian needs to be in attendance, a regular education teacher and a special education teacher. Not really listed on here, but we're going to talk about it anyway. Possible other folks that have items to speak to regarding the student. For example, if evaluations were recently done, let's go back to Deb's example of, an occupational therapy evaluation, we need to have an OT at the table to discuss those results, be able to explain them and answer questions. The local education agency rep, you may see this on a form where it just says LEA. That's basically a person who is in the role to commit resources for services for this student in attaining his or her IEP goals. Underneath that are agency representatives. When we get into this transition piece of, this 14 plus, we have folks coming to the table. Some are maybe from ORS, Office of Rehabilitative Services, and they will be working as a part of your team toward employment for your students. And also you will have someone at your IEP table from BHDDH, which stands for, are we ready? Behavioral Health, Developmental Disabilities in Hospitals. We just call it BHDDH. And that might be someone from that agency or a RIPIN representative coming to the table to explain adult services and the application that goes along with that. And we have a wonderful webinar that you can absolutely access regarding that process. Now, just to get back to the student for a moment. So obviously we want the student at the table. It's imperative that the student's goals and wishes and interests are being represented there, particularly as we are discussing post-high school goals. And we want that student to be able to speak to what he or she is looking to do with his or her life moving forward. However, sometimes that student can't be at the table. There's a lot of different reasons. However, if the student can't be at the table, we want to make sure that that their voice is represented in some way. I encourage families to have that student write out a statement or dictate a statement for a family member or a teacher to bring in to submit during the meeting that outlines his or her interests and what they're looking to do as they move through this process and then after high school.
Can I jump in here or just add one little thing? Again, these students they're required to be invited at age 14 in Rhode Island. So this, if you have a child, anything like mine, this was a process of getting to the point where he was not too nervous. He wasn't. So it's okay to build on that experience. And it doesn't have to start right at 14. The younger, the better, as far as getting a child used to coming into a room with all these adults, right? So maybe if you start off small, he comes in and he introduces you, or she comes in and she stays through introductions, and to hear some of those positives, those strengths, that's a great place to start. And it's a great way to get youth used to that this is about them. And so nothing should be about them without them. Okay, Deb, do you have anything?
Just let me add that if that student is not or does not want to attend that IEP meeting, the regulations are clear that the district should be, the IEP team must document, and they do use the word must, they don't use that too often, but must document how the student's preferences, interests, and goals were obtained. So again, this isn't just optional or wouldn't it be nice if that, for whatever reason, as Bethany said, if there's a reason that child isn't going to be there, schools need to find ways to make sure that child's wants and concerns and dreams or whatever are brought to this process. The other thing that I just want to say before we move on is, if you notice on the slide, you'll see that there are certain roles that are in red. Those roles, if no one else shows up at a meeting, those 4 roles, the parent, the regular ed teacher, special ed teacher, and that LEA, that person who can commit resources and help with decision-making, they have to be there for this to be a legal meeting. That's why this is not this signature on this particular page is only a signature to sign in. It's not, it doesn't show that there's some kind of consent given, but it is a very important piece of this document.
Thanks, Deb. And I'm going to turn it over to Anne at this point.
Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about transition assessments. So we know that youth change their interests often, and that's totally normal. And we don't expect anyone or everyone to keep their same goal all throughout their life, right? We all have changed things about our lives or about our paths. But what this does is this kind of formalizes a way of looking at the 3 areas of post-graduation life, right? We all kind of, our lives are all broken down into kind of these 3 areas. So I'm going to jump down just to highlight them. They are education and training, employment, and independent living. So beyond just, and we do want to capture, as you can see in those statements, those I statements next to in the area of education and training, in the area of employment, we do want to hear directly from the youth about what they envision themselves doing after they complete high school, a year after high school. However, we do need to kind of formalize it a little bit. And we want to make sure that we're helping students investigate things that are out there, right? So assessments are a really good way to collect good data. If a student says they want to be a doctor, it's really helping to drill down to what is it about being a doctor that really that student likes. Is it that they want to be a physician, or is it that they like medical settings? So those assessment tools really are ongoing. So what you should see in this top area here, as far as the date, the assessment tool, in which area that they're investigating, what we should be seeing is a nice kind of, it should go throughout the years. We should be building, right? We don't ever just want to only assess what a child wants to do as far as education, and we want to build. We want to make sure they start off general and build in complexity and really help a family, a teacher, and a student really get down to what they're interested in and where their strengths lie. Again, we're going to talk about present levels of performance and things like that. And this is information, this is where we're gathering it, right? If we talked about those 3-year evaluations before, that's really good information as we build an IEP. But now this is kind of what makes it different from that IEP for kids from 3 to 13. We're really getting to some more data, some more real hard, good information to build into what we're putting in the IEP. So again, they should be ongoing. They should be documented in this portion of the IEP. And I'm going to encourage you to ask to see them. That's not always kind of, as you're going through an IEP at the annual meeting, it's not always the first thought. And it's not because nobody wants you to see them. It's just because teachers use them to build an IEP, but it's really great information for a family to know, right? There's pieces of our kids that sometimes we don't know about yet. Okay, so we encourage you to ask your teachers about those assessments. Ask if there's anything that you can do to enrich that data by doing some home ones, okay? On the bottom, I talked quickly about measurable post-school goals. Again, these should come right from the student. Read them. Doesn't mean that they can't change, and they really will change year to year, okay? That's it. Let's see what the next slide says. All right, present levels of performance. We talked about that blueprint. We're really getting down right here to the foundation. This is probably the wordiest part of your IEP as you look at it. It's usually got big blocks of narratives, and that's what it should be. It should be the foundation. It has to be the strongest. It has to be the richest in information. So it should give you a comprehensive description of your students' needs and strengths, and how it provides, how this IEP should provide a comprehensive description and give you that child access to the general curriculum. So it should come from a variety of sources, and again, those sources should be data driven. Okay, so again, a little bit more about present levels of performance. It should be data. It should give the teacher a chance to build some measurable goals. It should talk about how the disability affects that child's involvement and progress in general curriculum. I already talked about strengths, and it should include a parent's concerns for enhancing education. Also, it's going to allude to the modifications and accommodations that child needs. Okay, so this is what looks a little different, right? This in your IEP that was for 3 to 13. We really didn't talk about these things, right? We talked about strengths and needs and preferences in the areas of maybe reading, writing, math, things like that. But we didn't talk about it as far as it pertained to community experiences, employment, and things like that. So there's where you're going to see this, this difference. And again, it should include things, it should have some functional pieces in there around daily living skills, things like that. Okay, next. Okay, so we talked earlier about the thread from beginning to end. Again, here's where we're kind of anchoring our threads. These are those present levels. Functional performance, again, there are so many areas we need to focus on as far as it connects to functional. Again, we're not just talking about in the classroom, we're talking about in life, right? So there's a lot more pieces to bring data from. I'm going to give you a quick tip. When we talk and you review a new IEP and you have your old IEP, bring that old IEP and put it next to the new draft. Compare your present levels of performance. Are you seeing group growth? If you're not, maybe that's a point to stop and say, how come we haven't seen growth in this area? And then move from there. But we should be talking in this area around social emotional behavior, activities of daily living, communication, and the like. Okay. They should be, like I said, somewhat worded and wordy. These are not bulleted lists.
Can I add to that, Annie?
Absolutely.
This is important. A lot of times families are thinking about academic skills. This is the area when we talk about function, when you start to think about social emotional skills, self-advocacy, organization, kids where attention comes into play. This is where you really need to be gathering that data. Make sure it becomes alive and included on this IEP in order for us to then write goals from there. This is the stuff that can strongly impact academics, and then those goals related to academics.
Absolutely. And in the same way, as we talk about academics, we need to remember that, again, this is not just the reading, the writing, and the math that it used to be, but it's those areas and how they're related to a student's post-secondary goals, right? So if we have a young man who is proficient in math, like Dean here, and he states that he would like to be a math teacher then someday, then we know that any of his functional needs or even any of his academic needs, we're going to try and use those strengths to progress along on those goals that are eventually going to come out of these. So strengths are not just there as a placeholder. It should never be blank, but not just because, right? Not just because it's nice. We really need to have something in those strengths, because that's where, like I said, if I'm strong in something, I'm going to use that strength. If I'm a people person, but I have some needs in another area, I'm going to use that people person and that ability to talk to people to maybe help me along with those needs. It's a nice building block or a stepping stool to bring us up and maybe even the playing field a little bit. So these levels eventually are going to be used in your goals. They're going to be used in your, if we see it here, and this is the thread again that I was talking about, if you see it here in a present level of performance, either academic or functional, what that means is we need to see it somewhere else along the line. So we're planting the seed here, we're building the foundation, all of those kind of nice analogies. Okay. All right, so like I said, we saw it in the present levels. Here is where we should see it weave through into the next portion of the IEP. If we saw a need in writing, then we should see this box here where it says under academic, we should see writing checked off. Similarly, if we saw it somewhere that there was maybe some needs in the area of independent living, attention, problem solving, or organization, these should be checked off, and we will need to see it later on. Okay. Transition services. So this is important as far as it pertains to we talked about goals, we talk about areas of need. Now, sometimes what we need to do is we need to put some activities beyond just instruction. So transition services are coordinated activities that align with goals and needs. So what we do here is we want to take into account their strengths, preferences, and interests. We want to look at where their areas of needs are, what they have not accessed so far. And the example here on this page is for employment, in the area of employment. And your transition services will be aligned with those 3 areas of post-secondary goals that we talked about: employment, education and training, and independent living. There should be services in each of those areas. And what you can see here is that it says in this case that this young person is going to shadow a certified nurse assistant for 1 shift. So you can see that's not direct instruction, right? No one is making a goal out of this. But what it is it's something that's aligned to the child's or the individual's interests, and it gives exposure. It gives a set of, it opens the door a little bit more. Everybody needs exploration, and not that all transition services are exploration, but all activities in a sense are exploration for all of us, right? It could be something along the lines for independent living. It could be opening a checkbook. Later on, we're going to give you, you're going to have access when you receive the recording, you're going to have access to a set of transition service examples. To me, that was the most helpful and enlightening when I saw examples. It's very hard to explain what this service is other than giving you examples. As you can see, when I read this example right here, it maybe started to make a little bit more sense. And that's when it happened for me. So we will be making those available to you. It does give you columns here of the who will help, whether it's the school, and within that school, whether it's a regular education, possibly a guidance counselor, or a special education teacher that's going to be responsible. However, one thing I want to say, as you can see, there's a column for agencies and there's a column for family and students. It should not be, all these services should not be the responsibility of one. It should be the responsibility of all. So in this case, you might need a couple of different people responsible for providing this service. However, in another one where it's opening a checking account, obviously that's something the parent and the student are going to be responsible for. Teacher can't get involved in that. So there should be a really good blend and a good balance of responsibility in there. And then the start and the end date, that's a good, obviously that's not the same as the frequency or duration on an IEP goal, but you can do your best to kind of decide when that will happen. Okay, I think that's it for me. Before I tag Mark for questions, is there anything, Deb or Bethany, that I needed to add? No? Okay. We left this on here back in the day when we were in person. If you were with us at 300 Jefferson Boulevard, we might have stopped and done a group activity. We left it in here because, again, I wanted to refer back to the transition service examples. When you get that handout later on via email, Mark will be sending that out with the recording of the video. What I would hope you would do is take a quick look at it. You don't even have to print it out now. You look at it on your computer, take a look. There's so many examples, and quickly run through it. Run through it yourself. It would be interesting. Run through it with your student. See what looks like that would be really valuable, good activities to kind of move your child along towards what their post-secondary goals are. And then I encourage you, when you have your IEP meeting, share those. I'm not saying walk in with a list and say, we need to do this. But again, it starts that conversation and it's a good place to start. Okay?
Let me just say, one of the best things that you will get from today is this one document. And we wish we could give you a link to a website, but it really is this chunk that came out of this bigger document. But it's done in a graph, it's done in a table. It's broken down nicely for families, especially if your child is 12, 13, 14, and you're starting to think about this and you don't even know the questions. You haven't even thought, you're just trying to get through the day-to-day experiences. this gives you this, oh, kind of moment of, I hadn't thought about that. So we hope that you'll find that helpful too. Mark, what do you got?
So first question, just to check, the IEP effective date starts 10 school days after the IEP meeting date, unless the parent waives the 10 days.
That's correct.
Okay. And then another question we have right now, is there a possibility, so this person is asking, is it possible if you move from one town to another, can the student possibly stay at the school of the town you're moving from if you request it on the IEP? For example, if they move from a high school student from North Kingstown to East Greenwich, is there ever an accommodation made where they can stay at the other town's high school?
Well, I'll take that if you want. So in regular education, there are guidelines that the Department of Education shares in their basic education plan regarding students leaving. So I'm not going to touch it as far as whether an IEP would ever determine that or not. What I will say, I'm going to start here first. The regular basic education plan addresses timelines as far as how far through the year that a student might stay, not necessarily bus, not necessarily anything like that, but that's set out there. As it pertains to a child with an IEP, when a student moves from one city or town to a next, even from one state to the next, the IEP, the way it's written, goes with them to start, and then a meeting should be set up as soon as that family moves, registers the child in the new district, and sets a meeting with that IEP team. You contact basically the administration offices and start there with calling a meeting. They'll review that IEP and they will write a new one for that district. It's impossible to say that things will look exactly the same, but that's what the IEP teams decide. Deb, anything to add on that?
No, you hit it. I mean, I think we know that there's residency issues, right? So that's very clear, cut and dry. The times when a district might send a student to another district would be based on the fact that they did not feel, based on that IEP, based on the child's needs, that they could meet the needs of that child within this district. There might be a neighboring district that might be able to do that, but it's really, it's not about choice. If parents are thinking, oh, I can choose my child to be here, or we're going to move over there, but we really liked them. No, it's a pretty simple answer. No.
Right.
Okay. Are the transition goals supposed to change from year to year? Like the goals, there might be a word missing in this question. Are the transition goals supposed to change from year to year?
So I'll take that one too. So the only transition goals that are written specifically called that are the post-secondary goals of the child, of the youth. They might change. If you have a very single-minded young person, they might not change, but however, they should change a little bit as far as, because kids do change. So if you're talking about those post-secondary goals, those 3 areas of I statements, I want to be living in an apartment by myself. I want to be attending a 2-year college. Or I want to be in a training program learning to fix cars. Those obviously can change, don't have to change, should evolve with the student. Transition services, which can sometimes be confused with goals, transition services should change because we're going to assume that sometime within the yearly time frame of an IEP, that whoever was responsible for opening the checking account, shadowing the certified nurse, those are going to be done. And then let's build on them. So once I shadowed, maybe there's something else I can get into as far as a different activity. And you'll see from the printed handout that you do eventually get that there are levels, right? Some are really easy and some are a little bit harder. So I hope that answered.
Okay, that's it for questions for right now. It's back over to Bethany.
Okay, so we're back to the document and we're going to start off with program of study. So the program of study will be specific to your student in terms of what track they're going to be taking to help reach their goals. This could be college preparatory. This could be a VOTEC program for automotive. This could be a culinary track. This could be travel and tourism academy. It depends on, you know, what their interests are and what is being offered by your district. And it's really helpful to have a guidance counselor at that table to help kind of pick through what each one of those look like and what might be the best fit for your student. Assurance of transition services. These are very easy yes or no check boxes about being, you know, provided information about transition planning in those areas that Anne talked about: education and training, employment, and independent living. And also, you know, knowing that your post-school goals are based on those transition assessments, which will enable a student to reach the goals after they finish high school. This is just a really great place for parents to be able to stop and say, okay, have I received this information? And if I haven't received this information, it's time to pump the brakes and go back and kind of make sure that that process is being started and you are going through those steps that Anne walked you through at the beginning. Down at the bottom, the academic standards. Most of us will be checking off either Common Core state standards. Those are the ones that we generally see, or you can see down at the bottom there, there's an other box. A lot of us might check off alternate assessment standards there. And I think that's it for that.
I'll just add there that if your child, remember in the beginning, Bethany talked a little bit about English language learners. If there are, if your student is an English language learner, then they may have also, they may be checked off as far as their standards being aligned for English language development standards. So that's another example here that we wanted to mention, because we mentioned it in the beginning.
Thanks, Anne. Measurable annual academic or functional goals. So Anne kind of, you know, got us rolling on this a little bit. We've got your area of need, and that could include, you know, anything that has been checked off in those boxes that Anne talked about. Our example here is writing. And then the baseline is going to be a statement that is pulled from those present levels of performance narratives that took place earlier on within the IEP. Should be very short. There might be a chart or a graph there, but this should be very short because the present levels were already really hashed out earlier in the process. So you've got your goal number, and the goal numbers are important because as we go through this, Anne's going to go through services and things like that, and the services will have which goals they're tied to. So just keep in mind that, you know, the goal numbers will be important through this process. What can the student do by the end of this IEP? Remember that this IEP is a 12-month long document. And so Jose here, he's going to be using the writing process to write organized essays, and he's going to be hitting a level 3 on the rubric. How that student's progress is measured, again, it could be a rubric, it could be a formalized assessment done by a teacher. And then when the progress is going to be reported to parents, here it says progress reports will be sent to parents monthly. A lot of us who have students with IEPs, we see progress reports that come home just about the time that quarterly or trimester report cards come home. You should be getting progress reports as often as regular ed peers are getting their progress reported, i.e. report cards. And you know, how will that student's progress be measured? I just want to go back to that for a minute, because sometimes with rubrics and things along those lines, they can be really confusing for people who are not teachers. always ask them to explain it to you. They always ask when you need it, because sometimes, you know, in the meeting, they're going to fly right by. Okay, measurable short-term objectives and benchmarks. Right here on this example, they're giving you dates. So by November, Jose is going to be able to do this. By January, he'll do this. By April, and by June. This is a really great opportunity when you're looking at your students' progress. You know, you come to November and you say, okay, well, I'm giving my student a passage that's written at the 7th grade level. My student can't read 95 words correctly per minute. Is that a problem? Maybe we need to go back and we need to have this conversation. If my student is nowhere near 95 words a minute, maybe we need to go back to the goal and make some changes, or maybe we need to change some of the methods that we're using. It's a good way to kind of gauge the progress and how quickly it should be happening. And it gives you the ability to be checking that progress on your own without constantly having to be calling a meeting. But you certainly should be calling a meeting if you feel like this progress isn't being made. Each one of the goals should have more than one objective or benchmark. So it shouldn't just be one statement under there. And it just allows you, again, to know when to expect that progress. And did you have anything to add to that?
No, I just will add quickly, because I know we're getting short on time. And I do want to add that this is something, again, that Rhode Island does differently and goes above and beyond. Not all states break their goals down into short-term objectives and benchmarks. So again, we talk about Rhode Island is great in so many ways, and this is one of the examples.
This was one of the things that this RIPIN fought for, advocated for, because the motto was, a goal without a plan is just a wish. The short-term objectives is the plan, and without it, it didn't always make a lot of sense. So
thanks. Okay, so this is what we call the considerations page. And I'm going to go through these I'm just keeping an eye on the time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So very quickly, the first 4 that you see there, I know that our alignment is a little bit off, but just bear with me. The first 4 only can be checked off as yes. If the team is not able to check yes off to one of these, then they need to go back and take a look. So for example, did the team consider recent evaluations? If the team can't say yes, they've checked, oh, thank you. All right, that's fine. I'm rolling with it. If the team can't say, no, you know what, we haven't checked recent evaluations, then it's time for the process to stop. The team needs to go back, take a look at those evaluations, incorporate them into the current IEP and the data and what is driving these goals. And then by the end of all of that, they should be able to check yes off to the rest of those. For the rest of that list, these are all yes, no check boxes. And these are called special factors. Not all of these are going to be relevant for every student. So if the district is checking off no, it basically means that they've considered it. And in the student's case, it isn't relevant. And there are a couple where if the district does check off yes, that information around that should be found somewhere in the IEP. For example, one of them says, is the student blind or visually impaired? Does he or she need Braille? If you're checking off yes, if the team is saying yes, this student is visually impaired, somewhere within the IEP, a service needs to be tied to that visual impairment to ensure that student is making progress in that area, and that may include Braille. Another one is, did the team consider the need for assistive tech devices or services? Usually a team is going to check yes off. They've considered it. Not every student is going to need an assistive technology device or service, but the team will probably consider whether or not they do need it. Okay, we're good so far. We can drop down to ESY. So extended school year services, we usually talk about this as ESY services. There we go. Every student with a disability needs to be considered for ESY services. There are 3 factors that a team will consider when determining whether or not a student is eligible for ESY services. One is an emerging skill. So if your student in April just suddenly broke down the door and started reading, that is generally a consideration that the team is going to say, we don't want to lose the momentum of this emerging skill. So we want this student to get those extra weeks of services over the summer. The second factor for consideration would be recoupment. So this means, is your student behind his or her peers in a way that they may be able to recoup some of that gap between them over the summer? And the third area of consideration is regression. Some students, by the very nature of their disabilities, are at a very high risk for regression, and over the summer can lose 3 or 4 months of academic progress. And so in order to not allow that to happen, a student will be enrolled in ESY services. There's actually a standardized criteria form to determine the eligibility, and the criteria is tied to each individual goal in a student's IEP. Mark, ladies, anything to add before I ask Mark? Are there any questions?
So we have a few right now. One person asks, is the program of study section where you would put if your child is on a life skills or transition path?
Anne, you're on mute.
I can jump in there. So it's not that simple. I'm gonna say each student in a life skills class, each of their individual programs might look different, correct? Like there may be different standards that they are. So just because you're in a life skills class does not mean you are either on alternate assessment or whether your standards are being aligned to the Common Core. So that's a part of that IEP process and part of determining whether your child fits the criteria for alternate assessment. So it now doesn't necessarily have to do as much with the setting as far as the standards are. They're not always exactly lined. Deb, anything you can?
But would you put that under that section though, Anne? The program of study section? I think that was the question. Would you write like life skills program there?
No, 'cause that's a educational setting.
Got it. Okay, now I'm getting
right?
it.
So some students, I guess what I'm saying very clearly is that some students in a life skill program may have their IEPs aligned to alternate assessment. That's a standard, those are academic standards. Some may be aligned to Common Core, even if they are not at grade level. I think sometimes that's where we confuse things. You can still not be at grade level. You may be in a life skills program and still have your goals aligned to a Common Core standard.
And if I may just jump in, a program of study applies to all students, not just students with disabilities. So any general education student can be in a VOTEC program of study. So it's not necessarily so hard and fast as it may have come across.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, very good. In the standard section, next question, in the standard section, when a student requires SEL support in the IEP, should the Rhode Island SEL standards be referenced here?
So SEL stands for social emotional learner. Annie, you want to touch on that?
I'm going to say, so I honestly, I'm going to say, I can't promise I can give you a hard, fast, but answer on this, and maybe we need to look this up and get back to you. However, I think students who need support in social emotional areas can still need their IEP goals could still be aligned to Common Core standards.
Common Core.
So
But we
I guess
could add it,
I guess
right?
if social emotional is the only goal in your IEP, then that might be written in there as the only standards that the goals would be aligned to. So I think we may need to get some clarification from the experts on that.
One of the things, you know, when the IEP form, remember, we haven't changed IDEA in a long time, really. So when the form was created, we didn't even have SEL standards.
Yeah,
They didn't
no.
even, social emotional learning standards didn't exist. I can't imagine that it would hurt to add that
Right.
in there along with, because especially for those students that their challenges around their behavior, their social emotional learning are the biggest impact in their functioning and getting their education. It would only make sense, I would think, that it's not going to hurt, and it would
Right.
make sense to put that under other, right?
Exactly. It could be added. I think that's a really good question. You stumped us. But I think, like Deb's saying, it wouldn't hurt to have more at all. I don't think.
Yeah, I'd be advocating for it if my child, if
Yeah.
that was the biggest the thing that we had to think about, the biggest barrier for my child.
Yeah. Good question.
Okay, finally, when the team uses teacher observation or record review, is that considered current data, recent evals?
So it's considered current data. The question will be, it always goes back to, does this reflect the needs of my child? So if that really does, if they've got enough information there that they feel they can write that IEP, and the parent also, remember the parent's part of the team. So if the parent, if that's being shared and the parent's like, yeah, okay, I can see where that makes sense, that's great. If it doesn't sound like that, well, then we start looking at, does it need more formalized evaluative data? But when whoever spoke around variety of sources, when it comes to evaluative data or any kind of data that we're using to write IEPs, it doesn't need to come from one source.
Right.
It should be coming from multiple, multiple areas. And so yes, it can be used. If it's not agreed upon, then either parents or districts can say, maybe we need a little bit more. And that's when you would get into reevaluations.
Agreed. I think the variety is the important part there. I think everybody values what teachers observe. So observations are very important.
Sorry.
I think in conjunction with something else, it's even more rich.
All right, very good. Well, that's all the questions for right now. Go ahead, Ann.
Okay, I'm going to take it because of my delay at the beginning. We're running a little behind. So I'm going to try and fly through this with a little bit of some quick talk. Special education services. To me, this is the who, what, when, and where of special education. If you can answer those 4 questions here, you're getting a good picture of a student's day. The who, the goal number, right? As Bethany talked about earlier, it's still being woven through. She has a goal. We're going to fit this goal into, if goals 1 and 2 are around specialized instruction, we're putting them here. Who's going to be, where it's going to be provided, what kind of specialized instruction it is, who will be providing that instruction, and then the frequency. How many hours a day, how many days a week, and how many weeks a month. Begin date and duration and location. Again, pretty much self-explanatory, except I'd like to talk about location really quickly. Regular ed would be checked off if the child is receiving that specialized instruction in a setting with typical students without specialized instruction or IEPs. If the group is only encompasses students with IEPs, then we would be checking off other. So that might just be the special education classroom, things like that. Okay, I know that's really quick. Again, we can get to questions at the end if you still have any on that. All right, so again, same thing with related services. It's the who, what, when, and where of related services. If your child receives speech instruction or speech therapy, then their speech therapy goal would be referenced here in the first column. what that service is. So speech, description, the provider, and again, frequency, duration, and location are again all of the same. That location for a child who's receiving special education, speech therapy, you might receive 1 day a week in a regular education setting where the speech therapist comes into the classroom, talks, works with the child in the regular ed classroom. The other day, they might pull them out for some one-on-one therapy. So that can all be, kind of planted out on here in different columns with different durations and days. So it should just be a narrative, and it should give you an idea or a snapshot of your student's day. Okay. Supplementary aids and services, program modifications, and supports for school personnel. Quickly, these are the things that are designed to assist a student in achieving his or her goals. Supplementary aids and services are those things such as those accommodations. What are the things that even the playing field that, gives that student the same access to his education as his non-disabled peer? And this might be something, again, during the writing process here, we see that John's going to use a word processor. It doesn't give him an unfair advantage. It really just, like I said, evens the playing field. It might be those program modifications, and that includes any kind of modified curriculum or modifications to the general regular ed program. And then supports for school personnel if we have, say, a paraprofessional who needs some kind of professional development to better help that student, and not just to just be by his side, but to be able to provide the student with the support he needs to make his goals and access his education. Okay, so those are the descriptions of those things. As we talk, let's see, the next slide talks a little bit about what I talked about as far as frequency and duration. Frequency, I'm going to say, is probably the most important point I would like to make here. Very often we see as needed. One clarification I'd like to make is if we have it here as an accommodation that the student needs, then it's needed. We've already determined it's needed. As needed leaves things a little bit up in the air as far as who's determining it's needed. Is it the child? Is it the adult? We've already decided this, so we need to make it a little clearer. Getting into maybe some more clear language as far as daily, or if it's around math, daily during math class, anything that can help give that specific, so there's never a question.
Annie, I want to throw in here because this needs to be a strong piece. As needed should not be in an IEP, period. When educators were trained at the beginning of this, they received that message from the Department of Education. It's either needed or it's not needed. So anything like that, anything that language should not be in, because it's more of a judgment and it's allowing for human error.
Right.
Sorry, just wanted to add that in.
That's good. The rest, again, we've talked about beginning date, duration, location. It all has to do with that regular ed classroom or setting or other setting. So it's very important that those are clear. So anyone looking at that list is in full understanding and agreement with when those things and where those things need to be provided. Okay. That's it for me. I'm going to tag Bethany. She's next.
Okay, so the next part of this document talks about the education environment for your student. You have 3 categories right across the top there. If your student is receiving almost all or all of his or her special education instruction and services within a classroom with regular education peers, we're going to say that that student is in the regular class 80% or more of the time. If your student is receiving special education instruction and or services outside of the classroom for a portion of his or her day, he or she may be in the regular class from 40 to 79% of the time. And then the what we would consider the most restrictive would be in the regular class less than 40% of the time if your student is in a specialized designated special education classroom without regular education peers for the bulk of their day. And what is important on this document is the next section, which says explanation of non-participation in regular class, extracurricular, and non-academic areas. Because our goal is always to keep our students in the least restrictive environment, it is the team's responsibility to explain why a student will not be participating with regular ed peers in a regular ed classroom during academics, extracurriculars, and non-academic areas of their day. So just, and that kind of breaks down what we call placement and environment. Thank you. So placement is when we talk about, so if you look at that list, those check boxes, it's a continuum of placement from the least restrictive to the most restrictive, starting off with the general education classroom with the special ed services and supplementary aids and all of that stuff being pushed into that class, right down to the most, what we consider the most restrictive environment, which is a special education residential school in a separate public or non-public facility. I do just want to highlight the home or hospitalized instruction. This would be if a medical condition that won't allow a student to enter a building. That's generally what that means. In case it's very different than homeschooling, which we see that being confused a lot. And then down at the bottom, we see state and district-wide assessment accommodations. This is for assessments that all students take. This isn't just for a student with an IEP. So this would be, we call them RICAS now. I've been through a lot of different state assessments. We call them RICAS now. If your student requires accommodations throughout their day-to-day academics and functional, skills during a regular school day, they're going to require accommodations for that testing. There's actually a guidebook for those accommodations for students and what would necessarily go into place for that particular child. And alternate assessment, which is way down at the bottom. If your student's IEP is aligned to alternate assessment standards, which we kind of discussed a little bit earlier, this will be checked off and the alternate assessment criteria will be attached to this form. Okay, and this is the very last page that Anne actually went over already. This, the last page will be reviewed with the parent. At this point, the IEP is considered final. And again, I just want to remind parents that if they, at this point, they disagree with any part of the IEP, they need to take an action. Again, let me just remind you, there's no signing off or not signing off on an IEP. The IEP will go into effect in 10 school days unless a parent takes an action to stop that process. And that could be, as Anne said, calling a meeting or something along those lines. I think that's it. I'll just tag Mark and see if anyone has any further questions.
No more questions at this point. I want to thank everybody who stuck with us. That was an excellent presentation from Anne, Beth, and Deb. Do any of you have anything to add before we sign off?
No, I just want to thank everybody for hanging in there. I'm sorry that we went over a little bit. I hope if you have any questions, give us a call. Our information is up front. We have a wonderful call center who will take your questions, point you in the right direction, and someone will give you a call back to answer any of these questions. And again, it's great when you have a specific question. This obviously is a very open public thing. So your private conversations and concerns, it's better to talk it out with us and we can help you walk through those steps.
All right. Thank you one more time for doing this today, Beth, Anne, and Deb. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and stay safe.
Thank you.
Mark.
Thanks, everyone.